My past enemies are either dead or captured, and my past friends are scattered to the wind. Now that I think about it, I am indeed an old man.
Of 5 people, 3 must pay a price. These words are carved into my every wound.
If he were to forget everything, it would make things a lot easier for me.
Violet Lune, when will our retribution come?
So how many of you are sitting around here wondering why all these people are just fighting each other? I'm guessing it's probably most of you. And you know what? Fair enough. Unless you're talking to every NPC and reading all of the supplemental in-game texts, you're probably not that familiar with the group known as the High Cloud Quintet, an almost legendary group of 5 friends, 4 of whom we've met and one, it's complicated. But these friends fought alongside each other against the denizens of abundance for the Xianzhou Alliance hundreds of years ago, and of the original 5, only Jing Yuan remains aboard the Luofu in any sort of public fashion. So obviously something went horribly wrong at some point with these guys, but before we can even begin to theorize about what sort of crazy stuff led to all of this, we need to get a little backstory on each of the 5 High Cloud Quintet members. Now, if that sounds boring to you, trust me, it's anything but boring. If you thought the fate of Tingyun was a nice twist in the latest story chapter, you are not prepared for the level of twisty-turny, swervy-worvy, what the freakery I'm about to present here. So grab yourself a snack and a seat because the introductions will begin momentarily. Now, like I said earlier, Jing Yuan is the only one of the High Cloud Quintet still visible to the public eye. The rest are either dead, Mara-struck, exiled, or have been forced through reincarnation as a punishment for a crime. Sometimes it's multiple of these. It gets a little bit messy, and Jing Yuan just so happens to be the least messy of the quintet. Jing Yuan came from a family that traditionally served the Realm Keeping Commission, but he broke from his familial norms to join the Cloud Knights when he became of age. He was still pretty young when he saved his fellow knights from being brainjacked by a bunch of puppeteer jellyfish aliens, and that feat landed him in an important position within the knights and also caught the eye of the sword champion of the Luofu, and her name was Jing Liu. Jing Liu was not from the Luofu initially. She was instead one of the only known survivors of the Xianzhou ship, the Songxiang, which was devoured by the activated planet known as Rahu in the year 6300. Now, Rahu appears to be a planet capable of devouring entire worlds, and based on this text from the overview of the Xianzhou's Materia Medica, it seems to be a living planet. Not a planet with living things on it, but a planet that is itself alive. So that's fun. Anyway, it should be around this time that Blade arrived on one of the Xianzhou ships via a merchant ship. But at the time, he would have been using the name Yingxing, which doesn't appear to be his real name either, since he was a short-life species unrelated to the Xianzhou. We don't really know what his original name was, so I'm just going to call him Blade so everything is less confusing. Blade arrived on the Xianzhou with the intent to study weaponry, which means, believe it or not, Blade actually makes blades, or at least he used to. He was a craftsman, and in fact, he made all of the weapons for the High Cloud Quintet. Now, given that he wasn't a Xianzhou native, he would not have been naturally immortal, and it is illegal to make people immortal according to the Xianzhou law. And put a pin in that one because that will become important later. So I'm assuming that Blade must have been quite young at this point when he arrived, because Jing Yuan, at the very least, is described as a kid when Blade gave him his Devastator glaive. The two were known to bicker with each other, which just makes me think of 2 teens like Yenqing's age picking on each other, and it's just kind of funny. Also, the High Cloud Quintet sort of era of exploits, so to speak, was only about 100 years. As he got older, Blade became especially close to the High Elder of the Vidyadhara, Dan Feng, which is the previous incarnation of Dan Heng. We can infer all of this from how their relationship is described in the Passerby of Wandering Clouds relic set, which is a set that is told from the perspective of Blade. Now, according to this set, the two of them often sparred together, drank together, wore a matching set of custom bracers that Dan Feng crafted for them, and the relic set even describes them as being bosom friends. So, yeah, I mean, they are undeniably close. There's also a slightly odd instance where the relic set says that the two exchanged wine cups under the moon, and I know that to Western audiences this doesn't really sound like much of an important thing, but the original Chinese text uses some really obscure archaic characters which could be read as engagement, which does not necessarily imply a romantic thing, but it does heavily imply a deep, almost familial bond between the two, regardless. Now, later in the relic set, after Blade loses his mind to the Mara and his memories get a little hazy, he finds himself holding a jade flask that he made, that he also meant to give to Dan Feng as a gift, only to realize that his friend is no longer around. Some of you probably think I'm getting sidetracked here, but I promise I am not. The relationship between Dan Feng and Blade is extremely important, and it's second only to the relationship between Jing Liu and the final member of the High Cloud Quintet, who we know only as the Foxian. I really hope you guys are sitting down for this, because this is where this gift gets really, really weird. The Foxian member of the quintet was a very gifted Starskiff pilot, well-traveled and perhaps a bit reckless. If Blade's character story is anything to go by, anyway. She could shoot multiple arrows at a time with a recurve bow he made her while piloting her Starskiff. Honestly, she sounds quite a bit like Yukong, but she's definitely not Yukong, otherwise she'd be named as such in all the sources since Yukong is pretty famous, but I digress. Now, I really need to go out on a very, very bizarre limb here, and I promise that this will all make sense if you just stick with me for a few minutes, okay? Because I think I know who the Foxian actually is, and yes, we've met them, and yes, they're playable. It's Bailu. Wait, don't click off the video just yet. I know that Bailu is a Vidyadhara, so it makes zero sense if she's the Foxian of the High Cloud Quintet, but I promised you this was gonna get weird, so just stick with me, hear me out. I promise this will make sense. It'll be weird, but it'll make sense, okay? We'll get through this together. Okay. So Bailu is the next High Elder of the Luofu Vidyadhara, and apparently, before her, every Luofu Vidyadhara High Elder was one of Dan Heng's incarnations. But not this time, because Dan Heng was exiled for the crimes of Dan Feng. So that's oddity number 1. Now, oddity number 2 is when Jing Yuan regularly visits Bailu every year, even though there's nothing wrong with him and they have no apparent connection outside of doctor and patient. Now, he always brings with him very specific treats and gifts, like he knows what she likes, and he just makes small talk asking, how she is, if she's been eating, and then he tells her all about his expeditions to other worlds that he's been on. And Bailu really, really likes those stories because she has a serious case of wanderlust, similar to a Foxian of all things. And that's probably why she keeps trying to escape her confinement chamber. And this whole thing, when you read about it in Jing Yuan's character stories, is just so weird because it reads like he knows her, but she doesn't remember him. Like they were close friends once, and he even asks her about her dreams. Like those matter to him for some reason, and why should they? See, Vidyadhara High Elders are the only Vidyadharas that are supposed to dream of their previous lives due to some special artifacts that are passed down from High Elder to High Elder. But Bailu has never once dreamed of her past lives, and that in itself is extremely unusual, so oddity number 3. But I need to amend that statement, actually, because she doesn't actually dream until you finish her companion mission and she boards the Astral Express, because somehow doing so triggers a dream of another life for her, one where she was traveling the sky, going anywhere she wants to go, and she's so happy, but then she still wakes up crying. And how coincidental would it be if we just happened to know the name of a Foxian traveler with a connection to the nameless that were aboard the Astral Express? Oh hey, ding ding ding, looks like we've got a winner here. This is Bai Heng, a Foxian traveler, and as far as I know, this is the only reference to her by name in the game as of version 1.2. Now, coincidentally, the Chinese character used for Bai in both Bai Heng and Bailu are exactly the same. So, oddity number 5. So, assuming I'm not completely insane, how could Bai Heng, a Foxian, turn into Bailu, a Vidyadhara? And the answer to that is Dan Feng. He did it, or he's connected to it somehow. I don't know how he did it, but there's a few possibilities for how he could have achieved it. The most straightforward one is that he simply just has that kind of a power natively. It's suggested in a few places that he can perform feats of revival. I'm not really sure the extent of this or what it entails, but the only thing we can really confirm for certain is that he does have really powerful healing abilities. And if Bailu is any indication of the healing capabilities of a Vidyadhara High Elder, then he likely had the capability to revive the deceased since, she has a revive mechanic in her kit. Irregardless of this hypothetical ability, though, the bodies of the Vidyadharas are used as ingredients in multiple experimental drugs used to alter lifespans. The first is the draught of Draconic Surge created by the disciples of Sanctus Medicus. This drug uses Vidyadhara bone marrow to restore one's mind after it has been corrupted by Mara. And the more sinister instance of using Vidyadhara body parts comes from a rogue experiment. In the shredded notes of Scholar Bernini, he removed some of the fluid from one of the Vidyadhara eggs and injected it into himself. This completely reverted his aging process, all the way back to infancy, and then it seems to have forced him to dissolve into an embryonic fluid which couldn't exist outside of an egg, so let's just say he's not around anymore to tell us the results of his experiment. So, the Vidyadhara definitely have methods, and we know Dan Feng's crimes were sedition, since he incited a rebellion, and stealing immortality for someone other than himself. So he has to be responsible for reviving someone or making someone immortal and therefore preventing their death. Now, I personally think he did it for Bai Heng, and by giving her some of his flesh, I guess, he would have turned her into Bailu by putting her through a forced reincarnation. Am I completely insane? Who knows? I'll let you decide. Either way, we're going to move on with the assumption that I am right about at least half of this, and that we're going to now use this information to talk about what really happened and answer the question at the start of this video: why are these friends fighting each other all of a sudden? While the exact details are neither confirmed nor implied with any clarity, there are a few things I'm pretty darn sure about, and it starts with the destruction of Jing Liu's ship, the Sangxiang. Now, if you recall, this ship was destroyed by the world-devouring planet Rahu, but this planet was once home to an emanator of abundance known as Shuhu, who revived the planet and made it that way. While on the hunt for Phantalia, Jing Yuan mentions that he witnessed something called the Shuhu upheaval period aboard the Luofu, implying that this event must have happened in the Vidyadhara Palace area on the Luofu. Now, we know that the Intelligentsia Guild joined the Second Abundance Wars in the year 5749 and defeated Shuhu aboard the Xianzhou Yutui after Shuhu attacked it. Based on this minimal information, I think it's incredibly likely that Shuhu was eventually sealed in the roots of the arbor aboard the Luofu and remained dormant there for hundreds of years. It's very likely that the High Cloud Quintet were involved in several battles here, actually, some of them involving Shuhu and some of them maybe not. Now, eventually, the Vidyadhara would have had to give up their palace to imprison the arbor itself completely, and Dan Feng would have likely led the operation. Now, given how much the Vidyadhara sacrificed for the Xianzhou, I think it's reasonable to assume that there may be some resentment among their number, perhaps enough to lead to a bit of a power struggle later down the line, which would explain the act of sedition that Dan Feng was accused of in light of all of this. However, I would like to propose the idea that Dan Feng was more interested in trying to destroy Shuhu for good and recruited Blade to assist him, because, they were close. This is kind of the point. When you need help with something really important, who do you ask? You probably ask your closest friend, right? So that's what Dan Feng would do. He asked his closest friend Blade. I told you this was important. Anyway, I think that's what this memory here is supposed to be referencing. Now, I think Blade maybe owed Dan Feng a favor, and Dan Feng wanted him to research something related to Shuhu in return for that favor, so he parted the waters and gave him 2 hours to do it. But I also think something went very, very wrong here, and I think he ended up being blessed by Shuhu instead, hence his talent, Shuhu's gift. Now, Dan Feng may have tried to heal him, since we know the Vidyadhara bone marrow can stabilize the effects of Mara, and that might explain Blade's unique situation. In fact, we know there's something wrong with Bailu's, quote, dragon heart, and I find it curious that pre-Mara Blade had white hair, but post-Mara Blade has hair that is remarkably similar to Dan Feng's in style and color. I do wonder if the process of Dan Feng maybe offering some of his flesh to Blade in order to save his life might have been responsible for these physical similarities. But you're probably wondering where Bai Heng and Jing Liu fit into all of this, right? Well, I think Bai Heng caught wind of what these two boys were up to and followed them, only she was a bit more unlucky and didn't make it out alive. Unprepared, she probably died, and Dan Feng may have tried to also revive her by putting her body in an egg, meaning her situation may have been far more severe than Blade's. And I don't just say that lightly. You can actually check out this egg and read its memory of a time where a monstrous malformed dragon burst out of another egg, only to find itself stabbed in the head by a remorseful Jing Liu who softly whispered sorry to it as she did so. Like she was regretful, or like she knew who she was killing. That malformed dragon was probably Bai Heng undergoing a failed reincarnation. But the Vidyadhara preceptors probably thought that since Bai Heng had ingested the powers or flesh of the previous High Elder, that she could probably undergo a transformation under different conditions and gain some of his powers, thereby making her a new High Elder and freeing them of having to deal with Dan Feng. Jing Liu probably knew all of this because there's another egg memory where she demands the Vidyadhara let her see how she's doing. And she sounds desperate, or traumatized, or maybe both. Because what hatches out of that egg isn't the Bai Heng she knew, but probably Bai Lu, a Vidyadhara with no memory of her past self. My theory here is that Jing Liu and Bai Heng had a very similar bond to that of Blade and Dan Feng, so Bai Heng's death would have been particularly difficult for her to stomach. Knowing that two of her companions were at least partly responsible for Bai Heng's death, and that Jing Liu probably could have prevented the whole thing but didn't, is likely what triggered her Mara and sent her on a rampage, leaving only Jing Yuan capable of cleaning up the aftermath. Because you see, soon after all of this, Dan Feng would be charged with sedition and breaking the immortality taboo. He would then be forced to reincarnate as punishment, and his next incarnation would then be exiled, hopping from ship to ship until he finally settled aboard the Astral Express. Blade was probably quietly smuggled off the Xianzhou, maybe by Jing Yuan, where he woke up on another planet entirely, confused, alone, and somehow unable to die. And maybe things would have just ended there as a tragic story of the fall of some Xianzhou heroes, but Jing Liu was not killed by Jing Yuan. Instead, she escaped with vengeance, likely on her mind. Because you see, I think she wants justice for what happened to Bai Heng. We know that first she tracked down Blade and dealt him killing blow after killing blow over and over and over again, but upon realizing that he just wouldn't die, she turned this torture into a type of training for him instead, partly brainwashing his weak, Mara-riddled mind in the process. You see, it was actually Jing Liu's creed, that whole, of 5 people, 3 must pay the price. Blade is only repeating his training. Remember, it was Jing Liu who told him to bring that feeling of death to those 3 people she found responsible. And it's Jing Liu who essentially programs Blade into hunting down Dan Heng to carry out a revenge that is not completely his. Now, I say not completely because Blade is also likely resentful at some level. He potentially blames Dan Feng for his current pitiful state, and that blame could manifest into a grudge which the Mara then amplifies to the point of insanity. But regardless, it's Jing Liu who pushes him to that brink. Now, Dan Heng will pay the price for setting the stage for Bai Heng's death. Blade will pay the price for going along with it. And Jing Liu will pay the price for not stopping Bai Heng when she had the chance to do so. Now, there is one thing I haven't really touched upon yet, and that is the accusation of Dan Feng inciting a rebellion, or sedition, I guess. Now, on the surface, this doesn't appear to be related to the events I've detailed earlier, but if you dig a little bit deeper, the whole sedition thing might be a reference to the reason Dan Feng actually wanted to defeat Shu Hu in the first place, at least if the rest of my theory is correct. This undestroyed letter is a correspondence that takes place after Bai Lu has hatched and Dan Feng has been imprisoned. One correspondent mentions researching something very risky that could change the fate of countless people, but if it's successful, it could free them from a predicament spanning millennia. Now, I'm not sure if the Vidyadhara are the them in this letter or if it's the Xianzhou people in general, but this research involves cuttings from the arbor and the creation of the Bloomborn Scion. And I don't know what those are, but it sounds like they might be people born from arbor blossoms. This might mean that they are trying to research a cure for the Mara, and it could also mean that there's some type of exploitation going on in regards to Vidyadhara land, since that's where the samples have been coming from. And then we have a page from the Alchemy Commission's official gazette where it's mentioned that Dan Feng stood up for Vidyadhara affairs, which to me implies that their race as a whole was either being exploited or mistreated, and that it was likely going unaddressed. Add to this the fact that there was political unrest between the Vidyadhara Preceptor Council and the High Elder Dan Feng, to the point where some of them have even voiced the desire to usurp his authority. And, there are just a multitude of factors that could have led Dan Feng to at least incite a protest, of all things. But I think it's very possible that Dan Feng actually wanted to reclaim the Vidyadhara Palace and perhaps made a proposal to defeat Shuhu so that they could move back into their homeland. This proposal would have been extremely risky and very dangerous, so no doubt it was rejected, but if Dan Feng went through with it anyway, or tried to, and it went very, very wrong, I could see how that could be construed as an act of sedition. But hey, what do I know? I mean, we have such vague information to work with as it is. Any theory is valid at this point. We're just gonna have to wait and see. I have had one heck of a time trying to piece together all these little bits of information, so I hope at the very least you have found all of this entertaining. However, I will leave you with one more fun little observation while the credits roll. Now, if you watched my last video on the Mara Struck, you know that the Aeon Lan was a Xianzhou native that was willingly possessed by a fire alien known as a Heliobi before they ascended into an Aeon. Now, it turns out Heliobi have two very distinct features: their propensity to possess the bodies of others, and taking the physical form of a large teal or bluish-green flame. That should sound pretty familiar because that's literally what Fantalia is. She's a big teal flame that possesses the bodies of others, which means she's likely a Heliobi. Isn't that neat? I kind of wanted to share. I don't think anyone really caught the idea that she's like a fire alien. Like, that is actually what she is. She's like the she's like the Promare balls of fire. Like, that's what she is. It's kind of cool. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap things up here, so a big thanks to my channel members for being awesome and their dedicated support to this channel and for everything that I try to do with it. And a big thank you, little viewer, for watching. Take care, stay awesome, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.